Hi, it's Jules again. Welcome back to Environmental Science 140. This week we're going to be talking about ecology. We are going to look at some very basic ideas of ecology, talk about your student project beginning, move on through studying how climate change is affecting ecology, looking at some particular aspects of ecological study, population ecology and community ecology, and then we'll move on to resources. So, what is ecology exactly? Ecology is a biological study, so it's a biological science that looks at the relationships between living organisms and their environment. This is well illustrated by a scene, a riparian scene. Here you've got a lot of trees and different types of plants. You see all the green things here are probably chlorophyll containing, and they are all absorbing radiant energy from the sun and turning it into a chemical form of energy called carbohydrate. These carbohydrates are forming the basis of the food web for this ecosystem. Animals will consume the plants. The consumers will be consumed by other levels of consumers, and we have a trophic web happening. We'll be talking about that a little bit more too. Eventually these things will break down and revert to soil nutrients, and as soil nutrients they will support the growth of autotrophic plants, and those will be supporting heterotrophic consumers again. And so that cycle goes on and on. Ecologic relationships between living organisms and their environments means the living things and the non-living things. So looking at the structure and the functions of nature. Structures that function to convert radiant energy, for example, to chemical energy. That would be photosynthesis. So ecology looks for patterns in nature that helps us expand our understanding of how large ecological systems function. Ecology is the study of looking at functional and ecological diversity. Before we were talking about biodiversity as a variety of different species and their genetic variability. So including their diversity, they have a functional diversity. The energy flows through ecosystems, giving them ways of functioning that are different from other ecosystems. And this also provides them with ecological diversity. So these different ecosystems have their own ways of working and are effective in certain situations, more so than other situations. This leads to a great amount of species diversity because species adapt directly to their environments. A lot of different sorts of species in an ecological system makes for a very, very productive, sustainable ecosystem. We believe that ecosystems are going to show us a lot about how we can understand sustainability for us and take that into our lives and perhaps learn something from that. We know that within an ecosystem, say this riparian ecosystem, this forms the basis for some species. All species have roles in ecosystems. Some are native species, like these native salmon species for the Pacific Northwest. But there are non-native species and indicator species and keystone species, and we'll be talking about those as well. Each type of species has its own niche, which is sort of a way of life in this community, and it includes everything that affects its survival and reproduction, like how much water it needs and how much sunlight it needs and how much space it requires and what feeds on it, what temperature it requires. Turns out that salmon have a very specific band of acceptable oxygen, dissolved oxygen levels in the water. And otherwise, living large adult salmon have issues with oxygen. So we'll be talking a little bit about that because that's very close to the Pacific Northwest here. We talk about salmon a lot. So these niches that animals fit into, so their way of doing things, these niches, can be described in a couple of different ways. There are either specialists like salmon or generalists that have a much more broad niche. One problem with maintaining sustainable salmon populations is that we have impacted the niche of salmon, and they are highly adapted to a certain set of conditions. Whereas generalist species, say for example a cockroach, these animals are highly adapted for all kinds of situations and so are very successful and a pretty good fit in many different niches. We'll be talking about that a little bit more and discussing how ecology can teach us something about our own level of sustainability. Climate is a function of the ability for us to send some of the heat that comes from the sun back up into space. Currently, we seem to be trapping a great amount of that heat in the lower atmosphere, and as that heat stays in the lower atmosphere, it warms these ecosystems in ways that they were not certainly evolved to deal with. And so what this is doing is changing the animals and their ability to fit these ecosystems now, because the ecosystems continue to change. So we'll be talking about that just a little bit. We'll also be discussing the idea of population ecology. Population ecology deals with looking at populations of one species and how these populations interact with the environment and change over time and place. One example of this would be bark beetles in Pacific Northwest forests, and in fact in many forests. Bark beetles have always been a constant. However, with warming terrestrial ecosystems, increased populations of beetles have changed some of our forests and influenced what we understand those ecosystems to be able to sustain. So reduced the biodiversity there and increased the level of impact. We'll be looking at community ecology as well, and that differs from population ecology in that in community ecology we're kind of looking at populations of species with structure that have differences at the species level. So we'll be looking at that as well. I hope you enjoy the next few weeks, and I'll be seeing you online.